I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me here.
Anyone who watches the news knows that Washington is a complete mess these days. Mm-hmm. The partisan divide is enormous. Corruption and lawlessness seem to be normalized, even in the highest offices in the land. And given all that, why do you want to represent Georgia in the U.S. Senate?
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. There's, I think Washington has probably been turned into a caricature of itself. And I think in just the last few years, it seems that it's gotten worse. And I'll recount back to when I worked as just a staffer for Congressman John Barrow, 10 years ago. And we thought it was bad then. All of the gerrymandering, all of the, sort of the widening gulf of, partisanship to the point where people are yelling across this great chasm at each other. And I had the opportunity to, spend 2.5 years with Congressman John Barrow, really, went around the state with him, went to a lot of places that weren't, very democratic, were more conservative, more rural, and that experience sort of showed me, how someone who cares about constituent services, who cares about going and meeting with the people and listening to them, actually can find common ground. I learned that just in proximity to a U.S. congressman, and I think what we have right now in Washington is political leaders, and David Perdue, who's our current U.S. Senator, is no exception, that sort of kowtow to the party leader, and I think you're seeing that this sort of subservience. Quite frankly, it's you can't speak ill of the dear leader because he might tweet at you, he might say something bad and you'll get primaried. And so the party line is now whatever the Trump line is. And there's like no independence anymore. I think that exists to a lesser extent on the Democratic side. But as long as Democrats continue to take corporate PAC money, to continue to accept the paradigm that that special interest lobbyists, that corporations should be this invested in our political system, we're going to continue to have this, sort of corrupt system. And, I'm trying to bring some courage back to Washington, some transparency, some new energy, some new ideas. The largest voting bloc in America is the under 35-year-olds or under 40-year-olds, over 80 million Americans. And they're not being represented in the U.S. Senate right now. But if we can get someone from, our generation at the table, you'll have a lot of Americans who will finally have a voice in what is clearly, a very powerful political body, but has been, I think, inept and incapable of addressing some of these long-term issues that will affect not just current generations, but future generations. So I want to highlight and bring that perspective into the U.S. Senate.
Okay. But Georgia hasn't had a Democratic senator in 15 years. Mm-hmm. I'm actually a little surprised it wasn't longer than that.
And it was Zell Miller, so I wouldn't highlight that necessarily, but maybe Sam Nunn was like the last real Democratic senator we have.
So what do you think the odds are that Georgia will become a purple state, at least, anytime soon? And how best do you think Georgia Democrats can accomplish that?
Yeah, well, I think we'd have to look to the Stacey Abrams election. I mean, I think she proved that, a Democrat can run as a bold progressive, an unapologetic Democrat. Her playbook that her strategy playbook that she published earlier in August, I think laid out a very clear roadmap to turning Georgia blue. And that's not just focus only on those likely persuadable voters in the middle, but to talk to all voters. And that means to go to all 159 counties. It means to have a 159 county strategy. It means to not run away from issues, but take them head on, and not be afraid to say you might offend someone because you have a different political view. Because the reality is we're not going to agree on everything, and it's okay to go to a part of the state where talking about gun control and keeping deadly weapons and weapons of mass destruction and mass shootings out of the hands of people who could do harm to our children, to people at, county fairs, in our neighborhoods. Like, we need to address these controversial issues, and we need to take it directly to those people and give them that perspective that a lot of, I think, voters might have sort of a caricature of what like a Democrat might be. And so when we talk about, universal health care, we're talking about funding our education system, we talk about investing in solar energy. These are issues that we can take to all 159 counties, and again, talk to all voters. If we sort of try to triangulate and stick to just political platitudes and rhetoric and not actually give people detailed policies of what we want to see and bold policies, then I think we're going to have a real voter suppression of people who just, won't be invigorated or optimistic about voting because they'll think, what's the difference between the two parties? Or, the Democrats don't actually stand on the issues that I want to see.
And I do think there are some issues that will resonate with, anyone in Georgia, like especially in the rural areas. We have hospitals closing down, so I think healthcare is going to be a big issue, for example.
Yep, healthcare is a huge issue. I think in some of these rural counties, healthcare is worse today than it was, 60 years ago. Particularly some communities that only have one primary care physician, or where you have to go, an hour and a half to the closest emergency room. I mean, those minutes and those hours could be life or death. And so it becomes kind of a moral issue. We as a nation, are we okay with a huge swath of our country not having access to basic health care or even to emergency room services? And it's clear that the current system isn't working. And even beyond that, the people that are being abused by their own private insurers. And this is something that comes up in Medicare for All. People say, well, people don't want to lose. People love their private health insurance. And I would actually push back and say, I don't think people love their private health insurance. I think they're just glad that they have coverage, and that it's, that's being covered under their current employer. And that they love their doctor, or they love their providers, their gynecologist, their obstetrician, their eye doctor, their dentist. They love those people. Well, I don't think anyone loves their dentist, but they love it. And so under a universal healthcare system, you wouldn't actually lose the healthcare professionals that you like, because they would all still be under the single payer system, right? But now you don't have to worry about being denied coverage or having to be nickel and dimed by your insurance company that is more interested in profits for their shareholders than delivering the care, forcing doctors and nurses to go and spend a quarter of their time on paperwork as opposed to actually doing the job that they love to do. I think when we talk about transitioning to a universal healthcare system, one that will cover everyone, that will ensure that long-term care will be fully funded and that Medicare will be solvent. And so, people say that they're concerned that if we bring more people into the Medicare system, that it'll hurt current Medicare beneficiaries. But in reality, what we're talking about doing is bolstering and strengthening Medicare for the people who are on it now, but for future generations, so that it's there when they're going to need it most, which is usually most expensive part of healthcare is at the end of their life.
On to another issue. So you've come out in support of the Fight for 15 movement. And so why do you think it's important to raise the minimum wage? And do you think raising the minimum wage as high as $15 an hour might hurt small businesses?
Well, Clarkston was the first city in Georgia 3 years ago to raise our minimum wage to $15 an hour for our city employees. And at the time, the economists were saying that to live in Metro Atlanta, to pay for housing, transportation, childcare, for food, for the basics to live, in Metro Atlanta, $15 was the minimum wage. Not a living wage, but just the bare minimum to pay for things. And so for the city of Clarkston, it was, it's been a huge, success story. One, our employees, were glad to be paid what they're worth, number one. Two, the turnover rate in our city staff in those departments are a lot lower. And so just the savings of having loyal, committed, long-term, workers, more than makes up for, the additional revenue that we have to put into paying for higher wages. And I think that, when we talk about whether they're large corporations or even small businesses, I think that we have to recognize that if workers who work a full-time job, and we're talking, 40 hours a week, still can't pay for a one-bedroom apartment or pay for, groceries, or have to go on government assistance to be able to make those ends meet just to get by, then, we're talking about longer term and even bigger impacts on our economy and our society. And so the perceived pain that might be caused by having a higher minimum wage will be made up for by more money being put back into the economy. And, a good anecdote is, Henry Ford. I mean, he wanted his workers to be able to buy the cars that they were making. And so there's, a thought process and an economic theory, that says if you raise the wage for, workers, they're not going to hold it and hoard it somewhere. They're going to put that right back into the economy, which will create more circulation and create more wealth, and that will actually grow the economy overall. And so I support the House bill that was passed earlier this year. It's a 6-year phase-in to a $15 minimum wage, but halfway through, the CBO would do a study and would sort of quantify whether it actually is hurting the economy. And so I think there's certain kind of measures in there that would, recognize that there needs to be a gradual increase to that $15 minimum wage. But let's be honest, when the minimum wage was passed, I think it was Richard Nixon was president. If it had been pegged to inflation, the minimum wage would be upwards of $17 an hour right now. And you could argue that some of the issues, whether they're with healthcare, with housing, education costs, the inflationary drivers in our economy, those issues would be, less concerning to working people because they would have the money they need to pay for those basic things.
And do you support pegging it to inflation so we don't have to go through this every 5-10 years?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I think we need to peg the minimum wage to inflation. It's again like the theory, the economic theory of a minimum wage is that no American should have to work a full-time job and still live in poverty. And then again, when you pay workers at the lower income scales more, they put that money into basically paying for the things they need to live. And that puts more money into the economy instead of going into, buying back stock dividends or whatever, and, inflating stock prices, which is what you see in sort of the Wall Street, paradigm right now. You give them a massive corporate tax cut, and instead of raising workers' wages, they just buy more stocks to further inflate their stock value so that the corporate CEOs will get their bonuses and the tens of millions of dollars in the short term, but the long-term reality is it's actually, not going to be good for the worker or the economy.
So let's talk about voting rights.
Yep.
So the Republican Party has been accused of voter suppression in Georgia and other states like North Carolina. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court has ruled that partisan gerrymandering is actually legal. So how will you support voting rights as a U.S. Senator, given all that?
Well, I think the bill that passed the House earlier this year, H.R. 1, laid out a lot of reforms to our democracy that the federal government can control right now. And so issues of same-day registration, of funding, local boards of elections. I actually had a meeting earlier today here in Athens where I was, finding out that your Athens-Clarke County Board of Elections is, maybe not doing the best they can do to expand voting access. And sometimes it could be a budgetary issue. Oh, we don't have enough money to do satellite locations or extra early voting times. And so we have to recognize that that a core aspect of, being in a democracy is voting. That is the expression of our democracy, and we should make that a priority in our budgets. And so that means that everyone who is eligible to vote should be able to vote. If they don't, every resident should be able to, every citizen should be able to do the same day registration, should not have to jump through all these hurdles or have to sort of go through, this, serpentine, gauntlet to get to do the right that is afforded to them as a U.S. citizen. It means that, automatic reenfranchisement for people who have, served their time. So who they were committed a felony, were in prison, but have now served their time. They should have automatic voting rights restored, and that includes, preempting states from taking away those voting rights, after, or making it harder for them to, get those rights back, which you're seeing in Florida right now. The voters overwhelmingly said, we want these people to come back into the system, and the legislature just completely ignored that referendum and has made it even harder for people to get their voting rights back. And so I think there's things that the federal government can do. I would say the biggest thing that the federal government can do is to go ahead and preempt state legislatures from drawing congressional districts. You can't, I don't know if you can preempt state legislative districts from gerrymandering, but I think that the federal government can, and the Congress can regulate how their elections are conducted. And so there's been Jim Tanner from, I think it was Tennessee. He introduced, like 10 years straight bills that basically would put the reapportionment and the redrawing of congressional districts into the hands of a commission, basically a nonpartisan commission, a professional body that wouldn't look at political and it wouldn't look at political demography. It would look at communities of interest. It would look to create a more proportional and fair representation. And so we could truly say that, politicians aren't picking their own voters, and that voters are picking their politicians as the purpose of, a democracy.
That's the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
So how about guns? So, what's your opinion on guns, and what's the best way to stop the epidemic of gun violence we're experiencing nationwide?
Well, the best way to stop the epidemic of gun violence in America is to reduce the amount of guns that exist in our society. And so I'm supporting the March for Our Lives peace plan, and that involves universal background checks, red flag laws, a national gun licensing system. Those three things, by the way, are supported by the vast majority of Americans and even Republicans. And so those are three policies that, should be passed, the first session of Congress in 2021. I do support the other provision of some sort of mandatory buyback system for assault weapons from civilians. And look, a lot of people are going to say, well, are you going to send police to go confiscate guns door to door? And the answer is no. That's never going to be a reality. But we have to create a law and some sort of civil procedure where if someone is, a civilian has a gun that, is designed to kill as many people as possible with as much carnage as possible, we should just recognize that getting rid of those guns, getting them out of the hands of people who could do harm, is the best way to reduce mass shootings. We don't have to, we can just look to every other civilized and developed nation on this earth and see that if you want to reduce mass shootings and gun violence, it's taking the guns away that are able to, in 60 seconds spray out 100 bullets and kill people at a Walmart, at a festival, at a music, venue, at a school. That's the answer. And so it's not something we can do overnight, but as Americans, we should just acknowledge that reducing access to guns, better regulating guns is the way to reduce gun violence, period.
Yeah, and even if they don't do it on purpose, just recently, we have campus carry at UGA, and there was a student who shot himself in the foot, just recently. So it's just ridiculous. So maybe we shouldn't have guns on campus. So what other issues are important to you and to Georgia as a whole that you would focus on if elected?
Well, I support the Green New Deal. I think, if we look at the investment that solar energy has brought to parts of Georgia that haven't seen much investment in decades, Georgia is anywhere between the third and the fifth best state for solar energy. One for producing solar energy just to power, our buildings and our economy, but also producing so much solar that we can export it to other states. And so the fact of the matter is that a Green New Deal that, in my mind, is a localized, decentralized investment in America. It is a plan that would invest in local communities led by local leaders who are using local solutions to solve local problems. And so for Georgia, that can mean a lot of things. It can mean investments in regenerative agriculture and supporting farmers to move their operations over to, lower carbon outputs, which will, make their operations more efficient and also will, bolster their revenues. Investing in solar energy will literally bring tens of thousands of jobs to parts of Georgia that haven't seen that type of investment. It'll increase land values and thereby taxable revenues that will go into the school systems and to the vital services, will support the healthcare systems and the basic services that county governments and school boards are struggling right now to provide, because so much investment is going into Metro Atlanta. You're not seeing the same type of investment opportunities in places that are getting that are aging, where young people are leaving because there's not opportunities. And then finally, it'll create generational wealth, and it'll do it in a way that actually will be clean energy. And so, solar energy, is something that, if there's a solar spill, we just call it a nice day, but if there's a coal ash pond that's seeping toxic heavy metals into the groundwater, it affects not just the local environment for hunting and fishing, but also could affect people, who actually have to drink that water or live nearby who might have, a well access. And so
energy rates go up.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is investing in things like energy efficiency, investing in solar, wind, battery backup. These are things that actually will lower utility rates. Those sources of energy are the cheapest forms of energy that exist on the grid right now. And so we need to stop burning coal. We need to stop fracking natural gas. We have the solutions now to stop climate change and reverse global warming by squeezing out dirty energy and ramping up our clean energy, and then reducing our energy expenditures. And so that basically means using 50% less energy. And that means weatherizing homes. That means taking residential, commercial, and industrial building stock and investing in massive energy efficiency, which, by the way, the Rocky Mountain Institute put out a report earlier this year that said that, a Green New Deal could spend $800 billion on massive energy efficiency investments in America and yield $1.3 trillion in savings. So while we're saving money, creating jobs, we're also reducing our carbon, emissions, which is exactly what the scientists, 99% of scientists say we have to do to curb the massive impacts of what we're seeing in the effects of global warming and climate change.
And yeah, we are already seeing it. It's hard to believe anyone could say that they don't believe in climate change, in 2019 with all the wildfires and floods.
Yeah. Well, the issue is less about people believing in climate change. The issue right now is that people don't believe there's scientific consensus. And there was an article on Sunday where, and I posted this on my Instagram, but 17% of Americans are correct in believing that all climate scientists believe that humans are causing global warming. About 45% think that scientific consensus is split, that only 50% of scientists think that humans are causing global warming. And so if it's less about believing it, it's more about, well, the scientists don't even agree. And so we have to get the word out that the scientists who study this unequivocally say that we are causing global warming, and in order for us to stop global warming, we have to change the way we do things. And so that might be a little bit more of a straight, educational vehicle, is we don't have to convince someone whether they believe it or not. Like, facts and science don't care if you believe something or not. What you ought to do is trust the scientists who have been studying this for decades. Just like you would probably trust, your doctor, if they're the one who has the medical degree and understands, how to do the surgery, you're going to go with the person. You're going to trust that person as opposed to maybe a TV pundit who probably has no clue about surgery.
Well, that's all I have to give. Anything?
Now I could talk all day long, man. So we'll end it there.
Thanks so much for doing this with me.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, man.